Secrets of abandoned buildings. Who hides within their walls? Abandoned buildings have always filled me with an inexplicable fear. There's something sinister about them. Empty window frames staring like hollow eyes, grey concrete walls saturated with silence. Maybe that's why I resisted my friend's idea of exploring a deserted construction site on the outskirts of our city for so long. But in the end, curiosity got the better of me. This construction site had stood abandoned for over 20 years. Locals said the building was initially intended to be a luxury hotel, but the project was abruptly halted and the construction company went bankrupt. The reasons remained unknown, which only fueled our interest. We gathered late in the evening. My companions were Lena, Dan, and Artem, my friends and self-proclaimed adventurers. Armed with flashlights and a camera for some amazing content, we headed to the site. Even as we approached, the unease began to creep in. The evening air was damp, and the massive, shadowy structure loomed over us like a forgotten monument. Concrete walls had partially collapsed, and the staircases looked like they might crumble at any moment. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" I asked Artem, who had proposed the expedition. "Of course," he smirked. "Imagine how many views we'll get if we find something cool." We climbed over the fence and entered. On the first floor, silence reigned, broken only by the echo of our footsteps. Dust-covered walls were smeared with graffiti, and the corners were cluttered with broken bricks and rusty tools. "Have you heard the legend?" Lena suddenly asked. "They say a worker disappeared here when the construction stopped. His body was never found." I chuckled nervously, trying to hide my discomfort, but Dan sarcastically replied, "Classic scary story for places like this. If the buildings wallowed him up, it's probably because of a collapse." We continued our exploration. At first, there was nothing unusual, just dust, broken windows, and debris. But the further we went, the heavier the atmosphere became. On the second floor, I noticed that the temperature had dropped sharply. The air became cold and damp, like in a basement. "Do you feel that?" I asked. "Just a draft." Artem waved dismissively, but there was no draft. There couldn't be. We entered one of the farthest rooms, a massive space with a high ceiling and an old metal crane in the center. Beneath it, rusty rebar was scattered across the floor. "Nothing interesting here," Dan said, heading for the exit. And that's when we heard it. At first, it was a faint rustling, as if something metallic was being dragged. Then, there was a dull thud, and we froze. The sound came from above us. "Is someone up there?" Lena asked in a hushed voice. We shone our flashlights at the ceiling but saw nothing. "Probably birds," Dan tried to joke, though his voice wavered. Deciding to investigate, we cautiously climbed to the third floor. The stairs creaked under our weight, and our flashlights illuminated only a small patch of the darkness ahead. The higher we climbed, the stronger the feeling grew that we were being watched. At the top, we were greeted by a long corridor lined with numerous doors. We began checking the rooms. Most were empty, but in one, I noticed something unusual. On the floor were drawn circles, and in the center lay a pile of burned papers. "Was someone performing rituals here?" Lena muttered, examining the marks. We studied the drawings closely. They resembled symbols, but their meaning was indecipherable. "Probably just local kids messing around," Artem suggested, though his tone betrayed his doubt. Then we heard it, a groan. We froze. It was a low, drawn-out sound that seemed to fill the entire floor. "It's just the wind," Dan whispered, but even he no longer believed his own words. We started heading back toward the stairs, but then we heard movement behind one of the doors. This time, it sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps. Artem decisively opened the door, and we all froze. The room was empty, but there were fresh footprints on the dusty floor, as if someone had just left. "This isn't funny anymore," Dan said. We quickly began descending, but when we reached the first floor, our path was blocked. A wooden plank we had stepped over earlier had fallen, barricading the exit. "Someone's messing with us," Lena hissed. At that moment, I noticed my flashlight flickering. We stood in almost complete darkness, hearing only our own ragged breathing. "Run!" Artem shouted. We bolted toward a side exit we had seen earlier, but as we passed one of the rooms, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A figure was standing in the shadows, a person. "Who's there?" I shouted, pointing my flashlight. But the figure was gone. We scrambled outside, leaping over the rubble. No one looked back until we were at a safe distance. When we got home, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Who or what had been there? Why did the sounds and shadows seem to follow us? The next day, we reviewed the footage from our camera, but nothing unusual appeared. Only in one room, where we had heard the footsteps, the camera captured a strange noise, a faint whisper. Since then, I haven't dared to enter abandoned buildings. Sometimes at night, I dream of that corridor and the shadowy figure. And every time I wake up, I feel as though it's still watching me.